It seems that those volcanic eruptions are more frequently in the early 2024. What's the signal?
Well, they're not necessarily more frequent. It's just that what's happening nowadays is the volcanoes are being reported more readily. We have drones, we have satellite data, we can collect lots and lots of information whenever there's a new eruption. And particularly if those eruptions occur near where people live, there's people being able to even record them on their mobile phones. But actually, there's many volcanoes on the Earth that are all active almost all the time.
Actually, except the Iceland, volcanoes in Japan, Indonesia, and other parts of the world also occurs a volcanic eruption. Are they connected?
Well, they're not exactly connected as such. What we find is that the Earth has these plate boundaries on there, and these are places where magma can come up to the surface and cause volcanoes. So Japan, Indonesia, Iceland, these places sit along these plate boundaries, and so they're susceptible to having volcanoes. What's actually happening is the methods by which we can record and disseminate this information to the general public has become much more real. So in real time, you can actually go and watch an eruption, you can record it on your phone, and you can put it up on WeChat or what have you. And so it's a very instant way in which people are able to exchange the information about what's happening in and around volcanoes.
In the early 2024, there are some volcanoes erupting in Japan. Some people are worried about that.
Well, I mean, the volcanoes in Japan are active volcanoes, so it's quite possible that in the future Mount Fuji will erupt. It might have a small eruption, it might have a much larger eruption. There have been a number of volcanic eruptions in Japan in historic times.
Will there be more frequent volcanic eruption in 2024?
I don't think there's going to be anything more surprising than we see normally. What's important is the volcanoes that do erupt, if they're in areas where we have good monitoring, we're likely to have them reported more because they are able to be monitored and be watched when they erupt. What we find is that volcanoes themselves occur in cycles. So some volcanic activity increases at a volcano and then it slows down and then it may increase again. This is very typical of volcanoes such as Mount Etna in Europe, which is one of the most active volcanoes. It goes through periods when it's erupting, it goes through periods when it's quiet. As a volcanologist, we've been somewhat lucky to have some eruptions in 2024 already, and they've been recorded. I've also been very lucky to have visited China on a number of occasions. And one of the most beautiful places I went to was Wudalianxi near Harbin, where you have a fantastic volcanic landscape. So you do have some active volcanic systems in China, and they're quite spectacular.
How do you experts monitor the volcanic eruption?
So one way is to put what we call seismometers. They measure small earthquakes. And when magma that's traveling deep within the earth is coming to the shallow surface, it causes very small earthquakes, and those can be recorded. If you have enough of those stations, you can actually work out where the magma is in 3 dimensions. So this is very much what happened in Iceland. The volcanoes there are very well monitored. And so they were able to see that there was the potential for an eruption. And in doing so, they were able to evacuate the people.
Do frequent volcanic eruptions greatly influence climate change?
Well, what we find is that, first of all, the volcanoes that erupted at the very start of Earth's history actually produce the gases that make our atmosphere. So volcanoes are very, very important to life on the planet. Volcanoes generally, when they're erupting, they emit gases like carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide can affect the climate, but on a short time scale, because it doesn't stay in the atmosphere very long. Obviously, CO2 stays in the atmosphere longer, and that's the problem that we're having with man's input of extra CO2 into the atmosphere. When volcanoes are erupting on average the normal amounts, they just are part of the general cycle of the Earth's atmosphere. Occasionally in Earth's history, we have very, very big eruptions called flood basalts, and they can occur over very, very short periods of time with lots and lots of gases, and they do have the potential to change the atmosphere for periods of time. but we haven't had one of those for a long time ago.
Could you explain what's the relation between volcanic eruption and earthquake?
Well, as people will be aware, for example, with Japan, you have a place where you have very, very common earthquakes, and also there's lots of volcanoes there. And that's because volcanoes and earthquakes all occur along these plate boundaries, these tectonic plates around the Earth. So they are often found in the same places, but also, as I mentioned earlier, when magma moves up in the crust, you can generate small earthquakes. So sometimes earthquakes can be directly related to the movement of magma, but they tend to be much smaller. The big earthquakes that cause a lot of damage, they're tectonic earthquakes, and they're happening because rocks are moving next to each other along these tectonic plates.
And is it rare for the volcanic eruption to lead to the tsunami? Because sometimes after the volcanic eruption, some countries will release a warning about the tsunami.
Tsunamis linked to volcanic eruptions tend to be the case where you have volcanic islands. And what you have is an eruption, and sometimes you can get a collapse of material. You get lots of material collapsing into the sea. So they can potentially generate tsunamis. So for example, there's been some eruptions on Stromboli, a volcanic island in the Mediterranean, which has caused some small tsunamis because parts of the volcano collapse quickly into the sea. The things that cause the largest tsunamis generally are big earthquakes, not volcanoes as such.
According to Smithsonian Institution Global Volcanic Program, there are currently 47 volcanoes in continuing eruption status as of 15 December 2023. And what does this mean?
There are a number of these active volcanoes that are constantly showing signs of activity. Now, that number that you quoted, that changes through time because, as I say, some volcanoes have cycles where they might be more active at certain times and less active at others. So, for example, Mount Etna often erupts quite regularly.
It's reported that some experts think a warming planet due to climate change is likely to contribute to the rise of volcanic erupting.
Not necessarily. What tends to happen is that the climate change is causing more instability, let's say, in the Earth's climate. One area where it may cause more eruptions is places like Iceland, where some of the volcanoes are actually buried under ice. Now, if you remove that pressure of the ice, you may remove some pressure on the volcano, and there's the potential that those volcanoes could become a little bit more active. But in general, the cycle that causes volcanism is not necessarily directly linked to the warming and cooling cycles of the Earth.
知道视频，有趣有料的新闻短视频。